morning, good afternoon. Welcome to today's SVDX session. My name is Nancy Easterbrook. I'm the Executive Director of SVDX. We are so pleased that you're joining today's session. We've made a little tradition out of this. Towards the end of every calendar year, we like to look forward to the next calendar year and talk about the hot topics and hard questions for boards of directors. So today's session will be 60 minutes in length, and we will be recording it. So if you have to jump off early or miss the end of it, whatever, we will have it recorded and you can access it at a later date. I did want to make a note that we have a very special session today. It is our inaugural Christine Russell Memorial Program. I'm going to take just a few minutes to talk about Christine and why we're creating this program in her honor. Christine was a founding board member of Silicon Valley Directors Exchange and was a staple in Silicon Valley throughout her long career as a technology CFO. She served on multiple private and public companies and served in leadership at other associations such as FEI and NACD. Christine was SVDX chairman for many years and helped to guide and shape the values of the organization from the very beginning. She championed SVDX with great dedication, was a visionary, a steward, and a believer in the mission. Christine's leadership, wisdom, and warmth contributed to all organizations she was associated with. Her commitment to doing what was right was clear in every interaction she had. She will be missed for her wit, enthusiasm, generous spirit, thoughtful mentorship, and wonderful sense of humor. Each year, SVDX will dedicate a program in Christine's name to honor her life, her legacy, and her lasting impact to her dedication to corporate governance in the boardroom and beyond. This annual event will remember Christine's vision, dedication, and contributions to educating board directors and advancing conversations around the topics that matter the most. We endeavor to remember Christine by bringing important issues to board directors of Silicon Valley and to promote her optimistic, can-do spirit to the SVDX community. So with that in mind, I'm very pleased to introduce our wonderful panel of speakers to talk about all things corporate governance today. Ryan Hourihan is a managing director with Meyer. He has over 10 years of experience advising boards and senior management on incentive compensation design, corporate governance, and performance measurement with the objective of supporting business strategy, value creation, and shareholder interests. David Larker is the James Irvin Miller Professor of Accounting Emeritus at Stanford Graduate School of Business. He's also the director of the Corporate Governance Research Initiative at Stanford Graduate School of Business and is a distinguished visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution. His most recent book, written with Brian Tyan, is The Art and Practice of Corporate Governance. Lori Yoler is an experienced board director, venture capital investor, and strategist skilled at advising companies and founders in imagining, building, and scaling disruptive technologies like artificial intelligence, cybersecurity, robotics, automation, quantum computing, and software. Among her many other accomplishments in areas of expertise, Lori studied AI in the 80s and has kept up with the field since then, recently writing a paper with Stanford on AI in the boardroom, and she teaches on the topic at Stanford. Lori has served on over 25 public, private, and nonprofit boards and currently serves on the boards of Church & Dwight, Aptiv, and NACD Northern California. Our moderator for today, Dan Siciliano, is a successful technology CEO founder and entrepreneur and recognized expert in corporate strategy and governance. He is chair of the board of the Federal Home Loan Bank of San Francisco and currently chairman of SVDX, board member of the Latino Corporate Directors Education Foundation, chair of the Council of Federal Home Loan Banks, and a fellow at Stanford University. So with that, thank you all so much for joining us today. Special thanks to Lori, Ryan, and Dave. And Dan, I'll let you take it away.
Great. Thank you, Nancy. This is among my favorite recurring sessions and topics for Silicon Valley Directors Exchange, but in light of the honorary nature in which we're trying to honor Christine, I think it is my favorite for the year. And that's a good segue into the fact that, as those of us who knew Christine realize that she was, first of all, most of the time a principal financial officer, if not the CFO. And one of the great characteristics in my experience of great CFOs is that they see things for what they are, not what they wish they would be. And then they call them out and they address them rather directly. And so today's topics have that theme. Christine also was the fan of, if you draw someone to spend an hour with you at SVDX, let's make sure that they can't easily get it by doing a Google search and watching some other video or reading some other law firm memo. So a lot of the topics we're going to cover, the way we're going to cover them, tend to be, a little bit different or otherwise unavailable. So please do feel free to type in questions. We'll try to catch those as we go along. But I want to kind of kick off with, the opening question of a lot has changed. You can say that every year when we do the session, but more importantly, I think a lot is changing simultaneously. There are a lot of dynamics that feel like they are accelerating the pace of board evolution of responsibility, things to which you have to pay attention to. It also feels like the world is just a little bit more complicated than it was a year or 5 years or 10 years ago. So in light of all of that, let's call it the enhanced scope and frenetic nature of board service and corporate survivalship, what do boards need to be thinking about a little differently? And that subtopic, the way we talked about it, was the oversight of boards. Is it passive or active? That seems like an overly simple treatment, but I'm going to ask maybe Dave to jump in first and just give us your thinking about the challenges in light of all of the new reality of board and corporate, behavior that board members face. Is it really different? And if so, how so? Dave, you want to take an opening stab?
Yeah. Thanks, Dan. It's a pleasure to be here. Yeah, I mean, I think the active passive is a good question. I mean, you can find boards on both ranges of this, but I think going forward, given the complexity and what's going on, boards are going to have to become a lot more active and engaged. Just looking at all the things that are happening around the world. We'll talk a little bit about AI, but other kinds of things that is stress, changes in the administration, how the SEC is, actively and aggressively going after some of the things that have been in place for a long time. But yeah, I think what's going to happen going forward is boards, I think they're going to have to spend a lot more time learning how the company really works and getting more into it. And I think institutional investors are going to be pushing, or they are pushing for this type of behavior. So I think, things are way more complicated. I think they're going to spend more time figuring this out. No doubt bringing in different types of board members and some occasions and things like that. So I think it's not a surprise. It's not going to be business as usual, going forward.
And that I may come back, Dave, and drill down on a couple of things, but I want to ask maybe Lori, you sit on a variety of boards, some of which are kind of cutting edge, some of which feel, and I mean this in a positive way, more industrial. So like you aren't just on boards that are always trying to find the next thing. You're on boards who are capitalizing on the last thing and doing very well doing so. But even in that context, what's your take on Dave's view about this migration towards an active, board posture? What does that mean in terms of board cultures? Yeah. Is it different than what it was, say, 5 or 10 years ago in this context?
I think it absolutely is. When I started my board journey, oversight was the name of the game, and it was mostly financial oversight. So we spent a lot of time on the financial statements, which, of course, by their very nature, are past. And we spent a lot of time asking questions about financial statements. And I would say it was very much all about the audit committee. And occasionally you'd say, hey, do we need to bring in a new board director? And does the comp look pretty good? Sure, it's within benchmarks, right? Now, comp is a big piece of the discussion and talking about, do we have the folks that we need now and for the future? And I think instead of just oversight, board members are asked for their insight and their connections as well as foresight. And so what the big question comes for me in board composition, there's a lot of board member recruiting for sitting CEOs or folks who are very active because we want folks who are dealing with today's challenge. But do boards today need specific expertise, or do they need a lot more time, or both? Because if it's more time, it's really hard when you have a sitting executive with very little time or someone who's sitting on 6 other boards. And the complexity has increased so dramatically in so many spaces. What exactly do you need? And I think you have to sit down and say, if we have to be a more foresight and insight oriented board to keep up with the pace, what do we need on our board in terms of composition? And then how do we build that trust and influence between the board and management and keep it going so we can have really strategic discussions about all these new risks that have come about and all these new opportunities? It's not just about risk.
So I want to put a pin in that notion of sitting or recently retired CEO, but particularly sitting CEO as the newly re-idealized, director, and come back to that. Because Laura, you observed that maybe if time is needed, that's not the right direction. And I know, Dave, you have some opinions. So let's put that in a box and come back to it. But I want to turn to you, Ryan, because, you sit at an interesting intersection of basically procurement of talent. I don't mean to oversimplify what you do, but you see the ebbs and flows, the tug of war, what it takes. And I wonder if you could highlight for us if this change in board demeanor, needs. I love Lori's phrasing of foresight and insight, right? It's better than the passive versus active. Like, take it instead as you were backward looking. If all you did was perfectly review and supervise financials, even if you do that perfectly, that was always backward looking. That isn't at all foresight, and it's not much insight, right? It's more detection. And so this idea of a new talent focus or a new demand focus for boards and senior executives too, Ryan, how does that show up for you, if at all? Is it really showing up in your intersection of where really the rubber meets the road? Like, are the searches getting harder? Are the available people saying, I don't have time? Do they demand either reassurances or more compensation? Like, what's really showing up on the ground?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, unfortunately, it's not necessarily manifesting itselut in director compensation. So I haven't seen
not
any
much does.
Yeah, there's not much that does.
Yeah.
But I do think, and Lori makes a fantastic point, that this concept of overboarding, where we've had historic ISS and kind of Glass-Lewis pillars that say, 3 to 4 boards at that point, I think you're finding an inflection point where that number needs to be revisited, given the time commitment and the involvement that are now needed from directors. I also think this idea between active and passive it's an interesting concept, because I think there's an inflection point to where an active board oversteps its bounds. So finding kind of those rules of engagement. And I think an active board, for all of the reasons that Dave alluded to, is absolutely where we're heading and where there's value. But I think understanding that inflection point where an active board might be overstepping their bounds, I have seen that create some, consternation with the management team when that comes to fruition. So I think knowing kind of where that active purview falls to and what that entails, and as I said, kind of having clear rules of engagement, either through updating the charter, those kind of things, is just very important as we think through kind of this evolution in board service.
That's great. Okay, so where we stand is that we all generally agree that the board space and the corporate governance space is harder, faster moving, more difficult, that therefore you've got this shift in expectations. It's underway, but I think Dave has outlined that it's going to be complete soon enough, which is it's active, and not only active, borrowing from Lori's language, but foresight and insight become the heart of what board members are contributing. And Ryan, you emphasize the point, directors aren't necessarily going to get paid more for it, but it's definitely showing up. And then you've got this tension, this balance between this active engagement from board members and what management's supposed to do every day. So this is a great setup. Let me ask a few follow-ups on that. I think we have to rename this session the hot and hard topic. So this is a hard question to solve. And I'm riffing off of a question that was submitted ahead of time by one of the panelists, or by one of the attendees, which I really appreciate. So it's very specific, but it gets at a bunch of stuff. And all three of you can answer this. But Dave, I know you think about this and have actually, I think, surveyed this. So let's say you have a highly competent, well thought of board member who is an expert in an area, and their policy posture on something of importance, material to the company, is divergent from the CEO. And it's been divergent for a while, and now it's become even more acute. They just aren't on the same page as the CEO. Where do you go with that? Like, so a very old school thing would be like, listen, if you don't agree with the CEO and you don't agree with management, time to step off the board. A different view might be, well, if this is your area of expertise and you're so well thought of and you're such a leader in this, maybe you shouldn't step off the board because you think the CEO's wrong. Now, you must think the CEO's highly capable otherwise you'd have a different posture about the CEO. So Dave, can you reconcile these two tensions, for this tension?
Yeah, I think historically, if you really were kind of orthogonal to what the management was interested in, I think you did kind of step off the board, or you're encouraged to step off the board. But I think, if you have somebody that's really got deep expertise, whether it be cyber, AI, or, international expansion or whatever, this is something where, a good chair of the board, or a good lead director is going to is going to deal with that in a social interaction and say, let's kind of take this offline. Let's really understand it and give plenty of room for both sides to articulate this. But obviously, boards are teams. There's decisions to make, and you just can't have somebody that's just completely orthogonal. But it's tricky, and I think we do see now these other topics that are new and in some ways kind of terrifying from a board perspective. Somebody's got a lot of expertise. How do you integrate that into the decision making? But it has to be a little give and take on both sides. I mean, the director can't just go crazy and dominate the discussion. There has to be the social interaction that makes it work. But I think good boards work that out.
Great. Lori or Ryan, anything to add on that?
I'm happy to add. I couldn't agree more. I think on many of my boards, I've been the techie or the person who has had the most digital savvy, perhaps. And you can't show up to a new board that's been together for a long time and say, okay, you guys are, old school, and I'm going to show you the future and we're going to implement it right now. I think how you bring your expertise and how you develop trust of the other board members is absolutely critical. And for me, having spent a lot of time in AI, for example, how do I bring the other board members along? Because you can't be the squeaky wheel saying you guys are all doing everything wrong and you guys are all in the past and I'm the future. You have to say, okay, I think this is going to be important. Let's figure out ways to work together. And as Dave said, the chair or lead director is critical in figuring out how to get there. But if a board member is brought on for specific expertise and folks are used to doing things a certain way, how they communicate, how they build trust, how they engage with the others and really bring them along becomes an absolutely critical skill.
Let me ask, Ryan, I've got a question I'm saving up for you in just a second. But I want to get through one more. Let me ask a related question, and it is about special expertise, perhaps, and also risk-taking. And increasingly, I'm also riffing off a question we received. Increasingly, boards are confronted with evaluating what to do in light of very low probability, but very high impact risks. And one of the tensions I've observed, and I think it's pretty well documented between many boards and the operating executives and management, is that boards are attuned to risks and sometimes become risk averse. I want to put an asterisk here and exclude certain regulated industries, particularly if my regulator at the bank level is paying attention. This would not apply to a bank, okay? But let's outline the following, which is, a board member appropriately raises a risk such as, a problem in the repo market. It's low probability, but what if it broke for 10 days? Or, the sudden devaluation, not the devaluation, but a sudden devaluation in the US dollar, and it has some impact. And I've been in situations, again, not a bank, where the CEO might say, well, yes, that's a legitimate risk. We've incorporated it, but the 1 in 500 chance in our estimation of that happening is very much outweighed by the risk-taking upside of the following things that we're doing, right? And essentially, we have a theory that says that investors are ideally diversified, and so there are risks that companies should bear in order to be successful. And if they're wrong, it might blow them up entirely, which is bad for the company, but for a diversified shareholder, perhaps not bad. And so can you comment, Lori, Dave, or Ryan, on this idea of what boards should do and maybe should not do about outsized risks, these big risks of which there is a very small probability? How do you raise it, but not perhaps put your hand on the scale too much? Like, how do you strike that balance? Because it feels like there's a lot of outsized big risks out there, low probability, but big impact. So how does the board navigate that? Who wants to go first? I'm happy to. I see Lori nodding most vigorously.
Okay.
Lori, you want to go first? No,
go
ahead.
First, that's why you do the risk posture and hopefully multiply the probability by the impact on the business and think about those risks when you're doing your annual risk assessment exercise. But I think cybersecurity is a great example, right? You could have a massive cyber attack that takes down the business. So we should spend our entire profit margin on cybersecurity, right? And so it's that balance of Every board's had to deal with cyber risk, and every board's had to think through, what do I do if this terrible thing happens and takes down the entire business? But how much do I actually spend, and how much do I invest for the future, and what am I taking away from others? I think certainly in financial services, since you mentioned a bank board, I just spent a lot of time with some experts in blockchain and cryptocurrencies. How much do I go in that? It's pretty high risk, but it's pretty central to the future of digital payment. So the board has to have a really hearty discussion, bring in expertise, and figure out what their risk posture is going to be and what kinds of risks they're going to take.
Let me tease out the fact that you outlined some formalities, Lori, that are sort of the blocking and tackling of governance here, which is whether or not you have a risk committee, there should be a formalized approach to risk by the enterprise. The board should have reviewed, if not perhaps even adopted it. You should have a matrix in which this question lands so that you can have a fulsome discussion. And I think that's probably the first sort of table stakes answer to the question, which is make sure you've actually done the hard work of having that framework for risk assessment. So you said that appropriately as if it's a given, but I just want to tease that out, right? And then what you described as the value add on top of that. Dave, I know that this comes up a lot, and I know you're also kind of a quantitative guy. Like I suspect you'd be disturbed if someone did not multiply the probability times the harm as a starting point for how to evaluate a risk. But is there more to think about there?
Yeah, no, I think boards over time have gotten a lot more sophisticated about risk. And I guess I'd make the distinction, the risk that, the cyber kind of thing that Lori talked about, clearly a major risk. And you go through this and put it in some sort of framework and make the judgment. But there's other risks, like your strategy risk as well, right? It's like you're going to go down this path, and something's going to work out or not, and then you do see some boards become really risk averse about certain things. And I guess the thing I always point out is that you make money managing certain risks, and the risks that you can't manage, you got to hedge or try to do something else to mitigate that. And I guess the silly comment is, if you got rid of all your risks, you're going to earn the risk-free rate of return. That's not what shareholders want you to do. You make money taking on risk and dealing with it, and again, some of them are strategy kind of risk. Is this going to work out? But there's other things like all of a sudden, you get crushed by a ransomware or something like that. What did you have in place to do that? And so it's very, very, very tricky. And all sensible boards have some sort of framework. They go through this. What's kind of interesting, what's the next step after you do it? Do you follow up on this kind of thing? I'm sure Lori on her boards hammers away on cyber and crypto and these kind of things. And so we talked about it, but we're going to talk about it again. Let's embed this in the board discussion.
Thanks, Dave. Ryan, I want to turn to you because what Lori and Dave have described, it sounds like requires a certain amount of executive talent to shepherd. In other words, you've got someone who's doing some assessments on risk. Maybe it's a third party, I don't know. But you've got to evaluate the types of risk. You got to evaluate what you can hedge against, what you can insure, what you simply confront and part. Like there's a lot to this. And I think Dave highlighted that boards have gotten better at it. And I think that's in part because enterprises, even small to medium-sized enterprises, have gotten better at it. But where does that show up in terms of how the board should be thinking about that expertise on the board versus at the executive ranks, or is this something that's outsourced? Do you have a view, or it's the market?
Yeah, again, something Meyer does every year from the compensation perspective is a risk assessment on the executive comp programs to say, is there anything that we would view as being, so, we kind of codify it in our lane, so to speak, from a compensation perspective. But for I agree with everything Lori and Dave have said. Most of the boards I sit on have a plan in place, have earmarked what those potential huge risks are, and kind of have triangulated some sort of, impact value and said, how much are we willing to spend to mitigate this risk? But from a talent perspective, I just think the board is more savvy and in tune with what those risks are deeper in the organization than they might have been 5 to 6 years ago, because of a greater focus on deeper human capital management a more robust news media where they're seeing these things happening in real time to competitors. So I just think there's a stronger sensibility around these issues in terms of these are things that we need to have conversations about. Whereas 7-8 years ago in a lot of the boardrooms I sat in, these things were not discussed more than maybe at one meeting a year for 5 to 10 minutes. So where it's now become something where you see more of a recurring theme, maybe even a 5 to 10 minutes at each meeting dedicated to these types of things.
Yeah, one thing it'd be, I'm sorry, Ryan. One thing it's useful to point out, if you're on the board, it blows up in some peculiar way. I mean, there's personal reputation risk that you confront as well. So, and I'd say there were maybe less of these, gigantic events of one form or another, but I think that's on the front of mind for directors, not so much from a litigation standpoint, but just personal risk. And, and if you're looking for other boards to go on, that comes up. And what did you do? And were you responsible? Things like that. So there's a personal aspect that I think is pretty important there.
Yeah, Dave, in fact, let me ask a follow-up and I'll tie another question that came up. Brian, you kind of queued this up, so thanks for that. Dave, at the risk of calling out how long you and I fear I have been at this, before you made the wise move from Wharton to Stanford back in 2005, I think we did this joint session on exec comp, right? And we did it in DC, and it was like this cool thing, and it was at that moment in time. And I remember, and I appreciated this comment that you made, but I remember you taking some flack for it at the time, and it was all about the context. You pointed out that boards have a tendency to risk aversion, and that you have to be careful not to create comp structures that create executives that are too risk averse. And then you talked about what you just talked about a few minutes ago. And I wonder, could you expand on that in terms of how a board can frame its culture and attitude to avoid that mistake? In other words, boards have to be attentive to risk. It's part of their job. They, by their nature, are risk averse. But on the other hand, they need to be really careful about not creating an overly risk averse set of behaviors or incentives for their executives. Is there a strategy to?
That's right. I mean, thanks, Dan. So Ryan, this is kind of what Ryan does as his day job, right? I mean, so it's like, here you got a company and, what's their taste for risk and what industry are they operating in is, and how wild is it? I mean, obviously around Stanford, there's a lot of wild stuff going on in the compensation programs match that. If you hit it big, you're gonna make a lot of money. But you have to be very careful when you start changing these dials from a board perspective. So if you're on the comp committee and you really have a highly leveraged comp plan, what kind of the Musk contract of, whatever, $1 billion or $1 trillion or whatever. But, when you dial that up, you better be pretty careful as a board that you're really spending a lot of time on does the strategy make sense and is the accounting correct? Because if the upside's so big, it sort of instills kind of a, let's just go for it. Let's gamble the company, and we know that's a negative NPV project for the company. So and there's good reasons to dial that up, but there's a lot of reasons for if you do that, you better be paying a lot more attention on the board about the investments that are brought forward and things like that. But the flip side is true as well. If you got a company where most of the compensation is fixed or, the targets are not that high, I mean, you're going to get what you pay for. And you're not going to get that innovation if you're looking for that. But that's Ryan's job, So, but yeah, I mean, those are very delicate things to manage.
And so we've got a question about ISS and their view of board service and too much, too little, the kind of thing. But I want to get there by way of talking about something you observed, Dave, as we discussed this session, and that is that the SEC feels like it is changing its posture, both formally and informally, on a lot of matters. Everything from proxy advisory services to things. Now, if we had a legally oriented board, the panelists here, they would point out that, the SEC is kind of doing two different things. You've got more responsibility around cybersecurity. You've got universal access to the proxy. You've got a bunch of issues related to clawback rules that are coming into effect now. You've got some 10b5-1 stuff that just got a little harder to manage. But I think your point is bigger than the minutia on these things. Your point is about the SEC taking steps that arguably some proposed, some actually enacted, that might leave more room for boards to maneuver, might leave more permissiveness for companies. Could you highlight your theory about that? That seems like a big
I don't know if it's a theory. It's just kind
observation.
of guess. But the I mean, I find it amazing when you look at the SEC, depending on who's in charge of the presidency, and I think we backed off a lot. There's this pendulum of swings, but I mean, we backed out of a lot of ESG. We backed out a lot of DEI. We've backed out of, like a lot of the human capital disclosures and proxy statements and that. And I was recently at a conference in Delaware, and the SEC chair was there, and it's pretty clear he's quite aggressive about, shareholder proposals, the 14A8, such of things. And, there's a lot of debate about that. Whether it's going to be binding arbitration for lawsuits and things like that. But, the proxy advisors have been on the focus for quite a while. And obviously the Republican administration seems to be a lot more aggressive about proxy advisors than the Democratic administration. But I think there's always been, in my mind, I've been a critical of that industry in lots of ways. But I mean, you start seeing these things, and it's going to have an impact on how companies behave. Where's the shareholder voice? If it's informed, how do the proxy advisors weigh in on that? What impact do they have? I'm not so sure about the antitrust litigation on proxy advisors, but I mean, there's a taste to change a lot of things now, and whenever that happens, I think it's worthwhile to argue or think about both sides of it. I mean, these are big changes, but there really appears to be a taste for the SEC to change a lot of things and make it much more business friendly. And I think we can debate whether that's hurting governance or not. And then, of course, you start seeing the companies leaving Delaware and going to Texas or Nevada or whatever. I mean, there's a lot going on. And I think, these are conversations that at some level you should have at the board, with your legal counsel and things like that.
Yeah, no, and I appreciate that last point, because I think that it's typical for most boards to get briefed or updated, either by outside counsel or their own counsel on issues of the SEC. But my fellow board members, and I don't hold against them, oftentimes they kind of glaze over on this recurring. It's technical, but it feels like there's a moment in time where you might ask some follow-up strategic implication questions to your counsel, push them on it, make them talk about, is this different from the past and the like. And I want to ask a part of that question maybe to Lori and to Ryan, and that is to say, how, if at all, is this showing up in the boardrooms, either Lori, the boardrooms on which you serve as a board member, or Ryan, when you're advising? Are people's considerations of the pros and cons? Obviously, I think Dave described the ESG, DEI, climate, these things have retrenched. That's obvious. But is there a sense that there's more leeway in terms of, not worrying as much about an ISS recommendation that's, a very particular rule? By the way, I should say, Dave, you gave yourself terrible short shrift. You've not only weighed in on these issues with proxy advisors for a time, you're among the first to quantitatively address whether or not they're adding any value. and you and people affiliated with the Rock Center were among the pioneers in that. And the short version is, it's not real clear these rules, certainly at that time, were adding any value. And it's not super clear that they are positive, impactful rules even now. So Lori and Ryan, what do you think? Is there a change? I mean, do board members, are they responding differently to this different environment or not? Lori, why don't you go first?
I think it's very important not to over-index on what social media is saying, what the proxy advisors are saying. Obviously, you have to follow the rule of law. And so hopefully you have a terrific general counsel and outside counsel and other advisors who are advising you on the way the wind is shifting. But with any of these big issues, hopefully there is a discussion with the management team and on the board of what makes sense for the company, what makes sense for the employees, what makes sense for the shareholders, what makes sense in our industry. And hopefully there is the stance that we're our own activist. You know, the activists, as Dave has uh, taught on many times, some of them can be very useful, some of them not so much. And so, what are the activists saying? What are they keying in on? Is that useful? Is that helpful? And hopefully, there is a discussion at the board on the concept of red teaming and blue teaming. Okay, let's take this to its worst case scenario. Let's say this happens. Okay, what's the upside of doing this? What's the downside? And hopefully instead of just as you were both talking about, a risk averse board, hopefully you have people highlighting, well, what are the opportunities? And we shouldn't just follow every suggestion that is out there and be sheep with everyone else in our industry. What makes sense for this company at this point in time and in the future? And it is always important to understand what's being said externally and what's being done externally. And as I said, obviously you follow the rule of law. But then what changes do we want to make? And ESG is a perfect example, where what makes sense from it is kind of a kettle of strange bedfellows in a soup, the ES and the G, but what makes sense for us from an environmental perspective, what makes sense from a human capital perspective, and what makes sense from a governance perspective. I don't care, it was interesting to see the jockeying back and forth, but what makes sense for this company and who are we and what are we about and what do we value as a company? And hopefully the boards are taking that kind of stance.
Ryan, before I take it to you, let me highlight something you just said, Lori, which is that last part in particular. I've seen some really talented general counsels prompt boards to, before they get the legal restriction requirement overlay, which goes from bright line to really vague, right? Like, so there's statutes and regs that are clear, but then there's regs in play. Then there's implied things that you should do to avoid stepping on landmines, either because proxy advisor doesn't like it and so there's a lot of gray there. They have them answer the question, what would you do? Like, what is in the best interest of the company? Before I tell you whether or not this rule has changed, what would you want to do? And I think you just said that exercise seems really valuable in light of the problem that Dave highlighted, which is it is quite extraordinary. We seem to be in an environment, there's an interesting case that'll appear in front of the Supreme Court shortly, that the president's taste will increasingly seem to flow down to the executive agencies, and you will feel the shift back and forth. So that exercise, Lori, seems more important than ever. So Ryan, the question comes to you, which is, have you seen some definitive changes in what you do day to day in light of these changes at the SEC, formal or informal? And what would you say about that?
I think it's still early days. I mean, there's certainly rhetoric in the boardroom around, some of these ideas of ISS, Glass Lewis, and maybe their purview softening a little bit in the grand scheme of things. I mean, I kind of echo Lori's point, though. To me, the best performing boards that I've typically worked with, even when ISS and Glass Lewis were, very bright line in their assessments, did what they thought was in the best interest of the organization, were cognizant of how that would impact ISS and Glass Lewis evaluation of them, and then were prepared to be proactive in terms of shareholder outreach or whatever else they needed to do to get those messages across. That said, I do have a handful of clients that kind of follow ISS and Glass Lewis fairly blindly and do not want to step out of. And I think for those clients, there is some conversation to say, are the handcuffs coming off a little bit to some extent, and giving us a bit more flexibility and, pivoting. Like, we've heard some rhetoric out of ISS and Glass Lewis that performance-based equity is, the focus on that is going to diminish maybe at the interest of potentially elongating the time horizons associated with time vested equity. Now, have I seen that necessarily come to fruition in market practice? No, but it is something that might, because again, in this environment, macroeconomic uncertainty, geopolitical uncertainty, setting those long-term goals has become more onerous. So, companies are starting to say, okay, can we move off of this kind of at least 50% needs to be performance-based equity for our executives, given some of this rhetoric that's coming out of ISS and Glass Lewis, to a longer, maybe a more retentive, quite frankly, equity program, because it's, rather than vest over a 3-year period, invest over a 5-year period or something of that ilk. So that's where I'm seeing it. I still think it's early days, because I think at this point, a lot of it's been talk. I know we were talking a little bit before the call about some rhetoric coming out of the SEC around kind of slimming down the CDNA. And I think this comes back kind of to Dave's point earlier. I mean, things like CEO pay ratio, something that was embedded, how much value has really been gleaned. I have a lot of clients that are kind of pulling their hair out in terms of the calculation. And I'm going, this is kind of a one-liner in the proxy that no one's really focused on and has been. So I think you could see, and those kind of things, I think I'm in favor of, to see some of that trimming of the fat where there wasn't necessarily any added value to the reader or the shareholder potentially in what you're seeing in those statistics. So I think it will be interesting to see how it evolves, but probably a bit too early days to see any tangible actions associated with it.
So I have Dave, I know you well enough though that for a moment there you wanted to say something. You kind of leaned in the screen. You don't have to, but I have a very specific question based on someone who posted a question. Did you want to add anything to that, David?
No.
Okay.
Thank you.
So here's the question, and I'm a pleaser, so I do try to. I can normally tell where a question's going when someone poses it. I kind of want to give them the answer they want, but I think I'm going to do the opposite here. So we got a very specific question, which was, the ISS positioning on total, overboarding, right? Ryan, you mentioned it, but Dave also mentioned the time commitment required, and so did Lori. So what's your take about this issue of overboarding? Like on the one hand, I think, and the questioner says this, someone could reasonably say, well, picking the number is quite arbitrary because everybody's circumstance is quite limited. My general impression is that the overall view of this is not going in that direction. And this is that box we set aside for CEO directors. It's one of the reasons that's attention, right? If you get a sitting CEO of a Fortune 1000 who's on their own board and then on another board, and then maybe they want to be on another board, some companies will restrict that. It seems like this is one of the areas that's not going to soften. I guess that's my question to you. It feels like this idea of board members having to be on fewer boards and picking, whether arbitrary or not, a number above which you're just in a danger zone is not going to soften. There's a lot of stuff that's softening, but not that. What do you guys think about that? And what do you think about the idea of overboarding? Are directors misestimating how much time they really should spend, even if they're super capable, super efficient? Maybe this is all they do now that they're retired. David, I know you have opinions on this, so I'm going to call on you to go first about this idea, but I'd love both of you, everyone else to weigh in, Lori and Ryan.
Yeah, I mean, I think overboarding is something you want to think about. I mean, if you have a real day job, being on one more serious board, I kind of view that as sort of max. And the reason is it works fine until something happens in the company you're on the board of. If you have a succession event, you have a restatement, you have something. I mean, basically, that's your full-time job. And you're not going to be able to do two full-time jobs. And if you're on more than one of those, I think it just becomes nightmarish. And I think what's going to happen is, and again, I don't know about I forget what the ISS thing. If you're not a active CEO or something, you could be on 3 boards or 4 boards.
Yeah, it's 3, I think,
yeah,
including your own company. If you
right. And I don't know where those numbers come from, but I mean, different people can obviously have, more energy and smarts about that. But I think we're going to move down the path where it's going to be rare to start seeing people like in the old days that are on 5 boards or something. I just don't sort of see it. I'm talking about public boards now. And so, I think the reason is there's going to be I think people are going to demand a lot more effort from board members going forward. So I do think, and people think about this, they're not honorific positions, right? 30, 40 years ago, it's like you're on a bunch of boards but it's that world, we've moved on from that.
Great. Lori, Ryan, do you want to add anything to that?
I have a number of friends who prefer advisory boards and have that mix between real boards and advisory boards where, you're probably not the one who's going to be called during a crisis of some sort. I think I saw Jensen Huang, CEO of NVIDIA, speak recently, and he said, most of the time I don't need my board members. We'll chat once a quarter. It'll be nice. But when I need them, I want them available 24/7. And therefore, I do not want my board members to have any conflicting time commitments whatsoever, because when I need them, I really need them. And I want them in the foxhole with me 24/7. So, how do you manage that? Because as a board member, you cannot predict how many of your companies are going to be in crisis at the same time. And crisis isn't always just something negative. It could be something positive, a huge opportunity, but you need all hands on deck maybe to think through it. And certainly succession is one of those areas where you really need to carve out a lot of time. There are hopefully a lot of discussions between the board and the executive team and the outside advisors, and you've got to have availability. So given that it's really choppy, you have to think about how you're allocating your time very, very carefully and what all you take on.
Yeah, I think that's really great advice. And the error that I see a lot of great directors make is that they take the average amount of time for each board and they add that together as their max commitment. But of course, both of you just said that that's not the time when you really need board members to step up. Ryan, has this shown up in your world at all? I mean,
I echo everything Lori and Dave have said. I don't see this going away. If anything, it probably becomes more pervasive and more onerous as the workload continues to grow, because I don't see it shifting the other direction. So, I think Dave said it well. I mean, I think, and you kind of echoed it, Dan. I mean, when everything's going status quo, sitting on multiple boards becomes a relatively easy proposition, but you need to kind of have that line of sight to say, not everything's going to go according to plan 24/7, and build, to Lori's point, kind of build that understanding into your anticipated time commitment. But I do think overboarding is a thing. I certainly think it's here to stay. And as I said, I think that number might drop from 3 to maybe 2 here in the not too distant future, quite frankly.
Got it. Well, we've tackled the pre-questions we received, a couple of the questions that we got in, and I've got 2 pending, but I on our list of must tackle topics before we're done in the next 11 or 12 minutes is included the influence of AI and what it means in the boardroom, right? We'd almost, on the one hand, I think Dave, I'm going to call on Dave second, and I'll say why. On the one hand, there's a lot of treatment of AI, and it feels overdone. But on the other hand, it does seem to be having some sort of impact and a consideration. Lori, to your earlier point, foresight and insight is the gold standard for board engagement now, and it feels like AI requires a lot of foresight and insight. So why don't I just ask a generalized question? Whereas Dave, I think you worry that we spend too much time in corporate governance talking about AI lately, but we'll see if that's the case. We'll come back to that. Lori, if you went first and tried to give us in a minute or two what boards should be focusing on in terms of the impact of AI and how the boardroom should be dealing with these many different issues and their many aspects, what would you say?
I think the most important thing for boards and for leadership teams right now is education, because how can you be overseeing something that you don't understand at all? How can you be making calls like, how much should we be spending on AI projects? Should we be pushing it to go as fast as possible, or should we be saying no employee can use it and creating all this shadow AI and employees using it at home? And I spend a lot of time talking to CIOs and CDAOs and CTOs who are very frustrated because they feel like they can't have a real conversation with their boards, and they feel like every project is a one-off they have to go get approval for and have to start all over again educating folks on why this might make sense. And I think it's easier when it's a cost reduction issue, but then you immediately reverberate into human capital, because if it's cost reduction and if you are making the business case based on, so we can get rid of all these employees, A, is that really something that you want to do? B, can you really? And C, what if it doesn't work? And why are we so it gets into, it becomes pervasive across the organization, no matter what industry you're in. How are you going to fund it? How are you going to measure it? How are you going to oversee it? what are your policies going to be? For example, one that I heard recently is, what's your policy on managers using AI to write performance reviews? Is that okay? Is it not okay? How important is that task? Is that a really important task that really your humans should learn how to do and be really good at? Or is that something you outsource to AI? Because a lot of employees and managers would love to outsource that task to AI. So it comes down to, really, how do you figure out how to educate everyone and bring them along? And they don't need to be educated in every technical detail, but they certainly need to have a fundamental understanding, a foundational understanding of what this is and why is it important, because this is not going away. This is a huge shift in every organization.
So I want to go to Ryan then Dave, but Ryan, I want to frame the following question related to what Lori just brought up skeptically, just for discussion's sake. And it goes something like this, which is, Lori's outlined, it's a big issue. It's impacting all types of companies at all sorts of levels. You need to get the board up to speed so you can engage in it, both from a risk, a strategy, et cetera. That makes a lot of sense. One of the ancillary conclusions that you might reach is to say, well, like other areas, maybe this requires some expertise on our board. Most boards are not lucky enough to have a Lori Yola or anyone near her level of expertise on their board. And so it might be a natural thing to be looking for if you subscribe to the expertise on the board strategy. But here's my skeptical question, which is, in a world in which mediocre AI talent goes for 10 million and the very best goes for 50 to 100 million, like, what in the world do you think you're getting if you're bringing in a director who's apparently a super duper AI expert? Now, Lori has been on these boards before this rose in prominence, right? So Lori's probably being paid way under market. So I'll set that aside for a later comment. But my question to you, Ryan, is, if I'm a chair or a head of governance, I say, we need this board member, what does that even mean in a world in which you're going to recruit someone for, I don't know, 100, 200,000 of cash plus some options or equity that's worth a double that? I mean, that should not move the needle for a world thinker in AI, or am I thinking about it wrong?
Well, no, I mean, I think so. There obviously there's a dichotomy between AI comp at the executive level versus at the director level.
Definitely, I'm playing devil's advocate, but yes,
I think at the executive level, to your point, you're almost seeing compensation being weaponized to some extent, because it's not necessarily about, I see an AI talent at your organization and they're worth $50 million. But if I can poach them from you and slow your progress down, that positions me that makes that $50 million spend potentially worth it. So I think that's the lens we're seeing from the executive comp perspective. I think from, a director comp, I beat the drum that maybe you're going to start seeing some differentiation. As most people know, director comp really coalesces around the median. I think the largest place you're going to find it manifesting itself is potentially in the demographics you find on the board, meaning you might have a younger subset of talent, whereas I think in the latest NACD report, the number of directors in their 40s was like in the low teens, maybe.
I think among the three of us, we know all 17 of them.
So I think you're going to start finding those numbers creeping up, because that's where a lot of the expertise in these newer kind of technological spaces lie. Not to say Lori is at the top of that, but I think Lori is a finite talent in that regards. There's not many Loris out there. So I think you're going to find the demographic of boards changing. And then I think the conversation then becomes around board refreshment, which is, maybe boards have historically had age limits. Do age limits still work, acknowledging that we're going to have potentially more 40-year-olds on the board than we've had historically? Do we need to pivot more to tenure limits rather than age? So it will be interesting to see how that manifests itself and evolves over the next several years. But that's where I anticipate seeing it first, before seeing it from a compensation perspective.
Great. Ryan, I'm going to toss you for after the webinar the two questions that we received that are a lot about board placement and board talent and the like. And I'm going to go to Dave. And Dave, you get to answer the question about the AI big picture. My refined question for you as well, in light of all this, what should board members do to sleep well at night in terms of their focus on this? What's enough? What's not enough? But I'd also like you to answer the last question we're going to ask everybody, which is, if you had to encourage people who are on the webinar today to do one thing, read an article, answer a question, think of like, what one thing would you really encourage them to do to be a better board member in the coming year? So you get both questions together. You can allocate whatever time you like to either one.
So real quick on AI, and Lori and I and some people at Stanford are trying to research this. If you got really good stories and want to share your stories, please reach out to one of us. We'd be very open to having that conversation with you. But so I think AI is going to it has the potential to revolutionize what goes on inside the boardroom. I mean, board members can get a lot more informed and bring alternative points of view to the boardroom easily. It was very hard to do that prior to that. I think board members need to experiment with this. Lori's got some great examples of some experimentation. And I think at some level, you have to come to the conclusion that there's got to be a lot more refreshment for AI to really, take over in the boardroom. And I think it's going to happen. But of course, what also is going to happen if you're on the board, you start bringing in younger people or replacing them. The onboarding is going to be very different because these people are not going to have the mass operating experience, which is typical and things like that. They're going to be more unique. They'll have different personalities. And I think that's really good. But, the onboarding task and let's say, having a board buddy to help them process what goes on at board meetings is going to be really, really, really critical. So I think it's really exciting, but again, it's going to be more work, but it's just consistent with, hey, the world's a more complicated place. So, what a surprise. But to the last question, I would say two things. One, I think you better be prepared to spend a lot more time going forward in board activities, board work, things like that. The other thing, this is a little bit pet peeve of mine. I think you got to get a lot more serious in measuring and managing and understanding human capital in the company. You're starting to see CHROs kind of moving up the kind of, if you will, the food chain, having a more strategic sort of place. I think that's really good. But I think the human capital element is where the action is going forward. And I think it's way under discussed in boardrooms.
That's great. Thank you very much. Ryan, I'll have you answer what one thing would you encourage, admonish folks listening to do this coming year?
I mean, I think Dave said it well. Certainly be open to change, be open to evolve, because I think that's kind of where I've seen most of my boards stagnate at some point, is they just, they've become somewhat risk adverse. They become stuck in their old ways and not necessarily open to the evolving landscape that's out there. Certainly expect more time commitment, I think, on the boards. More diligence, obviously, around human capital management, deeper in the organization, to Dave's point, and being more in tune with that. But don't expect more compensation. So expect more work, but not much more compensation. I'm sorry to be the bearer of bad news, but that seems where the direction we've been heading, and we're going to continue to head. So,
but if you hold equity, Ryan, and things get more valuable, there's your compensation.
Well, there you go. Yeah, exactly. Well, which is why most director compensation is delivered vis-a-vis equity. So I think, Dave, you said it well, but if you're looking for it to manifest itself in annual adjustments year over year, I think you're probably going to be disappointed.
Great. Thanks, Ryan. Lori, you get a final word on the thing that we should do in the coming year.
A couple things. First, I would say, if you're a lead director or a chair, really take a good look at the board agenda and look at what percentage of that board agenda is looking at the past and what percent is thinking about the future. And is the board agenda made up of the same stuff we've always covered because that's what we've always covered? Or is it the really important strategic things that are going to be important in the future? And changing up that board agenda becomes really important. Secondly, on AI, as David mentioned, we wrote this report called The Artificially Intelligent Boardroom that we published with Stanford and the Hoover Institute. And That's a good one to quickly peruse. And also, I love the Stanford Human-Centered AI Index. Eric Bjornhofsen,
We'll send it around to everyone who signed up. Yeah.
It's a great report. It's really lengthy, but it gives you all the topics and the frameworks. It brings in international experts, and it's a really great review of everything happening in AI.
Fantastic. Well, Christine Russell was always a stickler for running on time, so I'll take only 10 seconds to say we miss her, but I think she would have been proud of this inaugural Christine Russell Memorial webinar. And I want to thank you, Lori and David and Ryan, so much for making that happen, for taking the time with us. And we thank everyone who spent an hour with us today. Have a great day. Thank you.